thank you so very much for coming tonight. It's really an honor and an absolute delight. I thought the sit you led was just glorious right off the bat. And I think a lot of people will have done. And we're just incredibly lucky to have Rick. He's just he's a leader in this world of Dharma, deep Dharma, being kind of not retooled, just re-expressed, re-articulated with the wisdom of the best of modern neurology and psychology, so that really using the lens of contemporary science of mind and brain as a sort of backdrop for understanding the deep efficacy of the deep tradition, or deep traditions of Buddhism. And I don't know that anybody articulates it quite as well as Rick, in my view. And he's also, I know he I think quite wrongly referred to me as some sort of teacher for him when he was talking at the beginning. It's much more the other way around, really. And I've been learning so much from a very, very delightful sort of exchange of pointers that we've been engaged in our friendship. And I'm just so happy to be able to share some of that with all of you, so that you can receive some of the deep benefits that I feel I've been the recipient of from you, Rick. So thank you very, very much for coming to share with all of us tonight.
Oh, thank you.
By the way, I just got to say one more thing. You guys, if you haven't read some of his books, really put them on the list right away. Neurodharma is the latest, which is a fantastic, deep exploration of some of the psychological, neurological underpinnings of deep meditation. Secondly, Hardwiring Happiness is a fantastic book on well-being, understanding well-being. And then Buddha's Brain is that's definitely a modern classic now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Henry. I was just tracking the feeling here of being among friends in a very cozy kind of gathering. And it reminds me of a teaching from, I believe, Suzuki Roshi, who said that something like enlightenment is the feeling of coming home, So I'd like to talk here, as I said initially at the very, very, very beginning, about suffering. And I'd like to challenge a common way of talking about it or belief about it that we find in Buddhist circles, mindfulness circles, spiritual circles in general. And this is a really central subject because, as the Buddha said, I teach only one thing: suffering and its end. Suffering and its end. That's the key focus here. So what is this suffering that the Buddha was talking about? To begin with, I'd like to quote from the Sutta Nipata. My own background, so you know, I was initially interested or initially introduced to Buddhism through Zen in a very casual, just reading books kind of way. Later on, I've had a fairly deep training, I would say, in early Buddhism, as it's expressed in what's called the Pali, the language of early Buddhism, the written record of early Buddhism, the Pali Canon, pretty steeped in early Buddhism, and its modern expressions through the Theravadan tradition. For some years now, and definitely turbocharged by my encounter with Henry a year or two ago, I've definitely had much more of a Mahayana sensibility. So you're going to encounter a bit of a Mahayana critique, in a sense, of some of these early, of the expression, really, the ways that suffering has been talked about. So here we go. I want to start with a quotation from the Sutta Nipata, which is, when touched by the ways of the world, notably the worldly winds, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and ill repute, praise and blame, when touched by the ways of the world, a mind that is unshaken, stainless, sorrowless, and secure, this is the highest protection. So, from his awakening, the Buddha offered a teaching, the so-called Four Noble Truths, or perhaps better translated as the Four Ennobling Truths, truths for noble ones, those who are drawn to these truths by an inner nobility and who are increasingly ennobled by their encounter with these truths. And the four ennobling truths, they're typically described as truths, but Stephen Batchelor, among others, has really emphasized the notion of approaching them as tasks, which is also an approach you see in the Pali Canon, in which we are to understand suffering, the first truth or task, understand suffering, let go of craving, experience the cessation of craving and thus suffering, and fourth, develop the path of awakening. So we're called to practice, to not relate to these truths as sort of ontological statements about reality, but rather as invitations to practice, to undertake these as tasks, happy tasks, wholesome tasks for our own happiness and those of other beings, to understand as a task, to understand, to let go, to experience, and to develop. So these are opportunities, obviously, for a whole life of practice, and I'm going to focus on the first two, understanding suffering and letting go of craving, which is understood as the primary immediate cause, certainly, of suffering. So, is life suffering? A central Buddhist teaching is generally translated from the Pali being, where am I here? Bear with me. Sabbe Sankhara Dukkha. That's Pali. Sabbe Sankhara Dukkha, which is routinely translated as all conditioned things are suffering. Now, conditioned is a shorthand way of saying that something exists due to various causes. It didn't just pop into being out of nowhere. For example, a wooden chair is the result of many factors, including the trees it came from and the people who made it. The sensations of breathing, the experience of breathing, also is the result of many factors, such as the circuitry of the nervous system and whether you just took a big breath. Now, in turn, these causes are themselves conditioned by their causes and their causes, ultimately widening out into the whole universe and all the way back into time, 13.8 billion years or so, give or take a few so far. We see similar statements in Theravadan expressions today that not just that all conditioned phenomena are suffering, but that the aggregates, the contents of consciousness, being the bare apprehension of form, the hedonic or feeling tones, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral of experience, perceptions, categories, memories, perceptions, and then the volitional formations, thoughts, feelings, and the whole kit and caboodle, and then awareness consciousness itself. We find the statement that the aggregates, the entirety of all the elements of consciousness are dukkha, dukkha being the Pali word that's routinely translated as suffering. Wow, is this really true? Are all conditioned things indeed suffering? I don't think so. And I want to challenge a central belief in many Buddhist quarters that is routinely presumed to be true. Life is suffering, and which has huge implications. This belief drives an orientation to the world and to life that is more or less about, get me out of here, about practicing in order to get off the wheel of birth and death and rebirth, one suffering, miserable life after another. If we are to fulfill the task and the opportunity of understanding suffering, as the Buddha encouraged us to do, we need to unpack this teaching in order to find the way in which it is actually true, which we will get to in a very, very interesting and specific sense with huge implications. So I'd like to walk through different versions of this general statement, all conditioned things are suffering, different versions that I've encountered. Taken literally, in a bare bones kind of way, all conditioned things are suffering, this statement cannot be true. All conditioned things cannot be suffering. Suffering is an experience. A chair is a conditioned thing. It's a physical object that cannot have an experience. And it cannot be an experience in and of itself. So it would be wrong to say all chairs are suffering. And these points are not semantic or pedantic, because I'm really talking here about the immediacy, the intimate immediacy of what it's like to be you and me and each one of us. Now, a related version of this that I've heard that kind of moves on from all chairs are suffering, because they're obviously not, is life is suffering. Life is suffering. Yet, is it? Experiences. Suffering is an experience. Experiences, at least as this word is normally used, require a nervous system. Plants and microbes do not have a nervous system. Therefore, they can't have experiences, certainly in the sense of psychology or science would think about experiences. Plants and microbes cannot have experiences, so they can't suffer. Bones and blood and neurons and other components of a big complicated body like our own, they don't suffer either. This is not just semantics. Suffering is not out there in physical objects or in life as a whole. Most conditioned things are not suffering. Whoa! It can actually feel startling and freeing to recognize that suffering is really just a small part of everything. Let's pause and slow down for a moment. Take a moment, I invite you. What have been your own tacit beliefs or assumptions about suffering? Maybe kind of like, well, you're just born to suffer. Or this life is a vale of tears. I grew up a fairly casual Methodist and certainly saturated in a lot of Christianity. Is this notion that this realm is just a misery that we've got to get through on our way to heaven, if we're lucky and we work hard, rather than purgatory or hell, right? There are a lot of baked-in beliefs, a lot of psychologically rooted beliefs. I can say this as a therapist, where people just presume their own unhappiness as kind of an inherent or necessary aspect of life, and kind of a pervasive mood of discontent or anxiety or inadequacy or loneliness is just inherent in lived existence. These are very common beliefs, and they constrain and they incline us in all kinds of potentially problematic ways. So what have your tacit beliefs or assumptions been about suffering, and are they actually true? Now, certainly, I want to be crystal clear, there is some suffering. Certainly there is some suffering. There is some unhappiness, there is physical pain, there are certainly the first darts of life, the first arrows of inherent physical and emotional pain. Okay, that's really true. Absolutely. There is some suffering. And as myself, someone, who's quite aware of his advantages, which are achieved through disadvantaging others who are not, middle-class professional white men, I really think it's very important to not turn away from suffering at all. I remember once asking my friend and teacher, like Henry, look out, Henry, Gil Fronsdal, what he did in his own practice. What do you do in your own practice, Gil, these days? And he paused, kind of was startled, looked internally, and then twinkled and smiled and said, I stop for suffering. Right? That's the first ennobling truth. We must stop for suffering. Okay, we can stop for suffering. And what can open in you as you dwell in knowing that suffering is actually a small part of everything? What opens in you as you recognize that fact? Now, let's suppose that the term conditioned things is meant to refer only to our experiences and not to physical objects like chairs. Okay. Then a version of this statement could be all human experiences are suffering. We could extend it, of course, to non-human animals. All canine experiences, all fishy experiences are suffering. Is this actually true? And as I talk here, I really invite you to look at your own experience. Bring it down into your own heart and your own body, deeper than mere ideas. Now, there are certainly times when the mind is filled with physical pain, grief, fear, outrage, depression, or other overwhelming kinds of suffering. I've had those times myself. And I've been relatively fortunate in this life. Times when it feels like suffering is all there is. There are also countless people who each day must bear pain, illness, loss, disability, poverty, hunger, or injustice. And in the blink of an eye, something might happen, perhaps a car on the highway swerving into you, or a shocking betrayal by someone you've trusted that changes the rest of your life. Things can happen, to be sure. Suffering is certainly around us, and often, if not always, inside us. Compassion calls us to do what we can about it. All true. And still are all of our experiences suffering. Suffering matters because it is a particular kind of experience, one that is unpleasant. So there must be other kinds of experiences. The pleasure in eating a juicy peach is not itself suffering, is it? Nor are virtue, wisdom, and concentration, which are the three pillars of Buddhist practice. In other words, the not suffering of sila, samadhi, and panya, virtue, concentration, and wisdom, are not themselves suffering, right? Not suffering is as central as that. So awareness, a major focus of interest, certainly in the Mahayana thread of Buddhism. Awareness itself is not suffering. Awareness holds suffering, but it's not suffering itself. In other words, human experience certainly contains fear and grief, but that's not all it contains. Pause right there. Lots of experiences, not suffering. Now, any experience, even a painful one, is highly pixelated. And as your concentration deepens, and we train in the capacity to really, really observe experience in the moment, it becomes increasingly clear how compounded it is, how pixelated it is. So many elements in the experience of feeling, let's say, really hurt about how someone has treated you, or really worried about someone you love. Even in that experience, which we would say, oh wow, this is suffering, even in the experience of full grief, in that experience are many, many compounded elements that we can see with mindfulness and discernment, right? These pixelations, as it were, are like the individual brushstrokes of a painting. Most of the elements of an experience of great pain are not themselves suffering. The redness of red, the knowledge that a ball is round, the different aspects of the sensation of physical pain, many of these elements themselves are not unpleasant or suffering. Wow. Even in a pretty rotten experience. It's pixelated. It's compounded. Wow. Now, these points can seem merely technical, but it's not true at all. Because if we overlook what is not suffering, then we won't truly understand what is suffering and what causes it. And if we overlook what is not suffering and just take as a platitude or a cliche or a handed down from high that life is suffering, etc., we will miss out on experiences and resources that we could use both for increasing health and well-being and for reducing suffering. If everything is suffering, give up, meditate, and avoid rebirth as best you can, right? When you realize that so much is not suffering, then you're hopeful. And you're moved toward, wow, what are the resources directed internally and also externally that could help relieve the suffering that still remains? Recognizing suffering in yourself and others opens the heart and motivates practice. But these good ends, served by the recognition of suffering, are not served by exaggerating suffering. And one of those results of exaggerating suffering is fueling a kind of aversive attitude toward the world and this human life, a kind of meh, shrug, and dismissiveness. Samsara, what do you expect? Right? So let's get even narrower and consider this statement. Human experiences, even loving, beautiful, inspiring experiences, always have some suffering in them. This seems a lot closer to what could be true. But why would pixels, compounded elements of suffering, always be present somewhere in the movie of consciousness? At this point, it's helpful to think of suffering in a broader and looser way as that which is unsatisfactory or unsatisfying. Now, this is a way that many teachers speak. And by the way I've been kind of moving through this progressively is in response to one statement after another I've encountered from teachers or in Dharma texts, including from many wonderful sources. So I'm kind of working through responding to things that other people have said to me that I just don't think are true. I think are just taken for granted without looking deeply. And obviously the word Buddha comes from looking deeply, one who sees deeply. And that's really what we're called to in our task of understanding suffering, among other things. The way many teachers speak, there's an inherent dukkha, an inherent unsatisfactoriness in the transience of all experiences. Okay? So is this actually true, though? Does the inescapable impermanence, anicca in Pali, does inescapable impermanence make all experiences unsatisfying in the moment of having them? This is a common assertion. Is it actually true? Now, in the immediate moment of an experience, you can bring it into the present right now as you hear me or think about other things, look around the room. In the immediate moment of your eye moving around the room and contacting something else, or in the immediate moment of you thinking about something, what am I going to have for dinner later tonight? In the immediate moment of that, perhaps there is the smell of cinnamon or the recognition that a job is done. The smell or recognition is just what it is. It's just form. It's just a hedonic tone, a Vedana in Pali. It's just perception. There's just a thought. There's just an emotion. It is just what it is. And it is not in itself unsatisfying. It's just an experience. It's not inherently unsatisfying. Look into your own experiences as I talk and we hang out together here. Are experiences themselves inherently unsatisfying? I don't think so. Now, some might say that it is the inevitable ending, the impermanence of all experiences that makes them always unsatisfying. I've heard that. I've had a lot of people tell me that. Is that really true? Impermanence alone can't be the problem, because some kind of impermanence are welcomed. The impermanence of pain makes room for pleasure. When I get off the dentist chair, and I appreciate dentists, I'm really glad that experience, is over. Impermanence of the pain of getting my mouth worked on, let's say, or the discomfort, is welcome. So impermanence alone cannot be the problem. And even if it is the ending of experiences continuously that's somehow a loss, that loss must be balanced and is balanced continuously by the gain of each new moment as it arises. So impermanence per se cannot mandate an absolutely inescapable suffering. Impermanence is not a problem inherently. Impermanence is not a problem until we make it so. Now, yes, because all experiences are impermanent, they cannot be permanently, continuously satisfying. All right. But this becomes a problem only when we try to hold on to them. Bingo. The suffering, the stress, the dissatisfaction, the dukkha in Pali is not inherent in experience itself, nor is dukkha inherent in the impermanence of experiences. Suffering is inherent only in the holding, the clinging, the grasping, the aversion to experiences. That's where suffering lives. It's in the friction between us and the experiences continually arising and passing away. There's a quotation from the Dhammapada I wanted to share with you here, which is, whenever and wherever one encounters the arising and passing away of the mental physical structure, in other words, wherever one encounters truly, right closely, arising and passing away, one enjoys bliss and delight, which leads on to the deathless stage of nibbana, the unconditioned, experienced by the wise. In other words, as we encounter and just come very close to the emergent edge of now, all that is the wild arising, continuously passing away, and as we encounter that without resisting it at all, just dropping into it, it's almost ecstatic. We experience bliss and delight, which then leads on to a deepening sense potentially of nibbana and the unconditioned, if only as a momentary glimpse, which gradually becomes more stable and continuous. It's the holding that gets us in trouble. It's not impermanence. It's not arising and passing away per se. It's really good to slow down, to appreciate the implications of this. We still must face the inescapable first starts of life, the inescapable physical and emotional pains of life. We have to deal with death. We have to deal with pain in the body. We have to deal with the loss of loved ones. We must also deal with the inescapable transience of all experiences. They're transient. They're disappearing as soon as they appear. But we need not suffer these facts of inescapable pain and inherent impermanence. We need not suffer these as long as we can practice letting go instead of holding on. How can we do this? How can we practice that kind of letting go that undoes, that is the undoing in the moment of holding on, in which there is inherent suffering? Now we're into the second ennobling truth, the truth of the craving that causes suffering. There are two kinds of holding. A very important distinction I'm making here. First, we tend to hold on. We tend to get attached to, we cling to, we crave what the Buddha called the four objects of attachment. This is classic early Buddhism. First, object of attachment, pleasures, sense pleasures, which can include the inverse, resisting pain. Okay. Second, we tend to hold on to our views, including views about suffering, or who ought to be president, or, is there global warming, or did you over there do me wrong? We tend to hold on to our opinions, our beliefs, and our expectations. I'm quite familiar with this. Also, we tend to hold on to rites and rituals in the traditional translation, which today could be extended to various rules and routines, our own routines. And we especially hold on to the sense of self. These are the four objects of attachment: pleasures and resisting pain, views, rites and rituals, and the sense of self. Okay? Now, in terms of these four objects of attachment, and you might follow along with me, I know what it's like to want some ice cream, but then find that the container is empty. Sense pleasure. I know what it's like to have a strong opinion that no one should ever take the last bit of ice cream without seeing if I want some too. That's my view. I also know what it's like to want a new rule about ice cream in my home. Nobody gets to take the last without checking with me. And I know what it's like to feel, in terms of self, that someone took my precious, my ice cream. You might know what this kind of holding is like as well. This kind of holding is a form of craving, and you can observe it with mindfulness. Like everything else in awareness, this kind of holding, this craving, in other words, increases and decreases, ebbs and flows. With practice, we can all get more comfortable with letting go instead of holding on. And that's an endeavor of a lifetime. And I'm 40 or 50 years in. It's still a work in progress. Second, as I taught the last time I was with you here at Mountain Cloud, you can cultivate the sense of being already full, already balanced, already at ease, and therefore less driven to try to become, less driven to hold on to any moment at all. Through positive neuroplasticity, the ways in which neurons that fire together can wire together, especially if we help them a little bit in terms of wholesome beneficial qualities of mind and heart. Through positive neuroplasticity, this cultivation will hardwire into your nervous system an unconditional core of resilient well-being, gradually, with an underlying sense of peacefulness, contentment, and love. This cultivation is a beautiful and profound practice in which, in effect, we take the fruits of the awakening process as its path, borrowing a saying from Tibet, taking the fruit as the path. Okay? So, to sum up, even at its most intense, the first kind of holding is only a part of consciousness. It's not the whole of it. Not the whole of it. It's not the whole of our consciousness. It's not all of our consciousness is inherently suffering. And with practice, this kind of holding will gradually release. Good news. But there's a second kind of holding that, I'm sorry to say, is inherent in life itself. Inherent fundamentally, not so much in life, but in the operation of our own nervous system. Intrinsically, the nervous system, yours and mine and those of other non-human animals, the nervous system is always trying to stabilize and segment, partition, stabilize and segment extremely dynamic and interconnected processes. To serve the life of the body it inhabits, the nervous system keeps trying to hold on to the patterns of activation neurologically at a very complex cellular and molecular and fundamentally quantum level. The nervous system keeps trying to hold on to the patterns of activation that underlie each moment of experience, even as these patterns of activation keep dispersing and morphing into something else. When your mind is quiet and steady, you can really see this inherent clinging, this inherent neurobiological holding. It does produce an ongoing subtle tension, even when you're really peaceful, you're really quiet, your mind is really still. Nonetheless, certainly within any kind of ordinary consciousness, there's an ongoing subtle tension in the background, underneath it all, that is indeed a kind of suffering. I think this is the irreducible nubbin of the exploration that we've been pursuing here. As you really come into the present moment, as you really come into present moment awareness, can you be aware of this very subtle tension? It's like a holding, and it's called essentializing in philosophy and in psychology too. We're trying to hold, to cohere, to maintain what is extraordinarily dynamic and interconnected and a complete swirl, right? Can you be aware of that subtle process that's baked in, that's just baked in to having a nervous system that is the basis of consciousness, mental processes? Even when you look back, like when I look back at very, very deep experiences of stillness on retreat, even there, I can locate in the body memory of that deep stillness a subtle kind of contraction that's just inherent in the activity of consciousness and the biology of it all. So, this said, clearly this inherent tension is not the only thing we experience, obviously. Other things are being experienced as well. It's not the only thing we experience, but it is part of everything we experience. In this particular sense, suffering is indeed an inherent feature of our lives. While we cannot remove this tension, since it is grounded in our biology, we can understand it, which brings a sense of clarity and calm. This alone is very helpful. I suspect that people throughout history have located this inherent subtle tension that is about holding on and trying to stop the flow of transient experiences. And I think it's also quite possibly true that there is an inherent tension in the effort and the necessary effort of any individual animal to separate itself from the world around it, to maintain its own boundary, its own external membrane as a single-celled protozoan, or to maintain the distinction between body and world. In that attempt to maintain a partition, a separation, we, I think, do also experience a subtle inherent tension in our biology, our livingness, our physical livingness. And I think it's very possible that teachers of various kinds have identified this subtle inherent kind of suffering related to needing to stop the flow of ongoing experience, even though it's impossible, and inherent in trying to be separated, even though that too is impossible, and have then, through recognizing these two sources of intrinsic, inherent suffering, have built then larger bodies of belief that are way too elaborated and unfounded and actually not true. All this said, really important point as I finish here, and I want to open it up for your comments, your questions, anything you want to talk about. If we can accept these fundamental properties of animal living, of being big animals in life, grounded in life, right? Truly embodied. If we can accept these properties of embodiment, of the effort to stop what is impermanent, the effort to partition what is connected, if we can accept these properties and not resist them, then we don't add suffering to them. Wow! Wow! We're not adding suffering to these things. This kind of holding, these kinds of separating are just what brains do. It's just what brains do, In this life, there is always some tension somewhere. But amidst it and around it can be so many other things, such as an open heart, the undisturbed spaciousness of awareness, the sense of good company and sangha and community, including here with others tonight. So many good things, and thankfulness for all the good that is real. Just this is a source of happiness, and this as well empowers us and gives us hope and strength to deal with the suffering and the sources of suffering, both out there in the world and inside ourselves, that is real as well. And that's a good thing. Okay, thank you for hanging out on this journey. I hope it wasn't too semantic or technical. And I really invite you to keep coming back to your own beliefs or attitudes about your own suffering and what this life can hold. And I want to underline now we can open it up for comments or questions, maybe coming in through the chat, or perhaps someone might want to talk with me live. None of this that I'm talking about is motivated by a desire to minimize or dismiss the injustices, the problems, the pain, the sorrows that are real. I do also want to invite you to ask yourself, are there certain shibboleths, as it were, certain sacred cows in mindfulness, Buddhist, Zen, Vipassana, New Age, therapeutic circles that are just taken for granted, that are maybe not actually so true? Okay. Any comments or questions so far? I think we have around 15 more minutes.
I
Right?
will allow people to unmute themselves, and you will be temporarily muted too, Rick. So just to let you know that's coming.
Hello, I don't know if you're choosing somebody or if we can speak, and if I can't put my video on, it'll freeze. Thank you so much, Rick. That was just so lovely. And I'm also in your Wednesday class, so I've gotten 2 nights, which probably makes a difference. And I just wanted to share an experience that I had with sitting with you in the community now, which doesn't often happen when I meditate. And I was listening to your words, and somewhere in there you said something about receive.
Yes.
And so I got to this place where I thought, I am just going to very calmly receive the breath.
Great.
I'm not going to reach for it. I'm not going to grasp for it. I'm not going to try to control it. I will very calmly sit here and receive it and return it, like as a gift, right? As a gift, and giving it back, not holding it in any way. And wow, I got really calm and comfortable. And then I thought, what's really interesting is if you try to grasp for the breath, which of course, with COVID or asthma or anything, is painful and suffering.
Yeah.
But that's where the suffering would come in trying to hold the breath.
Exactly.
In trying to forcefully exhale. And if I just sit here very calmly and receive, and in this case, it's the breath, but it could be anything, and then just let it go as it would of itself. Right? There's a point there where I'm going to have to exhale,
right,
or be exhaled. But this idea of simply receiving and not getting that nubbin of that biological thing of craving the next breath or having to let it go. And I thank you for that experience. I hope
it's kind of almost ecstatic, isn't it? It's like the Buddha said,
yes.
It's bliss and delight.
Well, bliss and delight and very peaceful.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so thank you.
Well, thank you. Now, are you Elaine?
Yes, that's what it says. I'm the
okay,
same
good.
Elaine
You are Elaine.
Wednesday.
Because you had your hand up. I just wanted
yes,
to track
yes.
that. Thank you, Elaine. I appreciate that.
Thank
and
you.
I recognize you from my Wednesday meditation group too.
Thank you. What a gift. Thank you.
If I could just to repeat those 4 words that I played with at the very end: receiving, appearing, releasing, becoming. Receiving, appearing, in any moment, sounds, there is hearing, there is seeing, there is sensing, there is thinking, there is recalling, there is imagining. Right? Receiving it, just really focusing on the receiving it. Receiving, appearing, releasing, becoming. Releasing, becoming. The Buddha said basically this holding takes 3 major forms, which is we have craving for becoming, we have craving for sense pleasure, which includes the ending of pain. Second, we have craving for becoming. And you can feel that. You can feel that movement into the future or becoming a certain kind of a person, gaining mind. I think of the beautiful, pungent phrases in Zen, so many wonderful ones, including no gaining mind, no gaining mind, what the sense of that is. And then the third target of craving is not becoming, nihilism, wanting to die, wanting to not be here. And so it's really quite deep to really see what it's like, releasing, becoming, which means the real undoing of craving in the moment. And in that moment, there is indeed that bliss and delight that leads on to the deathless, potentially. Releasing, becoming. which of course involves a lot of releasing of selfing. Yeah. Well, let's see. You can see in the chat different comments from different people. So someone asked me, I'll just speak to it. You can public chats from Janine at 5:49 p.m. my time, probably 6:49 yours. Janine writes, I notice that I sometimes have a background sense of self that can be resistant to what is happening. Henry talks about the importance of allowing. When I notice a subtly painful experience of low-grade resistance and allow it, there is sometimes an immediate release of this suffering. Beautiful. If I am able to do this practice over and over again, is this a practice that can lead to neuroplasticity or neuroplastic change? Yeah, exactly. There's, neuroscience is a baby science. It's not like there's a specific study on this specific practice in a double-blind way with good neuroimaging data. We're probably some decades away from that. But if you, Janine, let's say, and others, do repeated practices of, releasing, right, resistance, let's say, there's going to be certainly a tendency for that to become learned. And one thing you can do is to deliberately heighten the possibility of neuroplastic change by letting that experience reverberate in your mind for a breath or two. In other words, we often will have useful, powerful experiences in spiritual practice or in our psychology that are so transient they don't have time to be recorded. Meanwhile, our negative experiences are very rapidly imprinted as traces in neural structure and function because of our brain's negativity bias. So we can help useful, beneficial experiences, such as the one Janine is describing here, we can really help them to land so you develop traits of releasing, traits of non-resisting. You can move from states of releasing and states of non-resisting and acquire the trait of non-resisting, the trait of releasing through, when you're having those states, slow it down for a breath or longer and let the experience reverberate within you. Get a sense of feeling it in your body and be aware of what's enjoyable about it. These are three major factors of neuroplastic change: duration, embodiment, and reward. And by deliberately, over the course of a breath or two or three, gently in meditation as it's appropriate, doing one or more of these three things, and I list other things as well in my books and stuff you can do, but these are kind of the big three to come back to again and again. As you do that, you definitely can very plausibly heighten neuroplastic change. And if you notice over time that you are indeed you are cultivating, bhavana in Sanskrit and Pali, cultivation, if you are actually cultivating traits of releasing as a way of being in this world and traits of non-resisting as a way of being in this world, if you're cultivating those kind of traits, you must be having underlying changes in your nervous system as their basis in the body. Which is great. So keep taking in the good, in effect. Slow it down, let it sink in. When you're having a useful song playing in the inner iPod, turn on the inner recorder. And those three factors of extend the experience, feel it in your body, focus on what is meaningful or enjoyable about it, what's rewarding about it, will heighten neuroplastic change. All right. So Grant Goulet at 5:50 writes, beautiful talk on suffering. Thank you. Thank you. It seems that our unique human ability to be metaconscious of our experience is a powerful evolutionary advantage, but it's also the source of our perceived separation from the world, nature, and therefore a profound source of suffering. Does that align with your experience and expertise? Yeah. And the way I'll just describe it is that we don't know really what's going on in the minds of cetaceans like whales and dolphins and so forth, right? But certainly primates and land vertebrates are trapped in the present, for better or worse. They don't have the human capacity, which has to do with a midline of cortical tissue, that can deliberately reflect on the past, imagine a future, and in ways that are saturated with the sense of me, myself, and I. This development of cortical tissue is, a great evolutionary advantage. It was a target of major selection. It definitely helped our ancestors live to see the sunrise and pass on genes that could pass on genes, on the one hand. On the other, as Grant says, it's the major basis of a kind of suffering, second dart suffering, that certainly our primate cousins with very intelligent capabilities, chimpanzees, other cousins, dogs, they don't suffer in this way. They don't have second darts. They're not throwing second darts. Our daughter had a beloved cat for quite a while, and we just say, Pistachio doesn't throw second darts. Pistachio, the name of her cat, could be hungry or scared or irritated or, unhappy about something or in physical pain, but Pistachio did not add any second darts to that first dart, right? It's our human capacity. So a lot of deep practice is about swimming upstream against the rivers of evolutionary change that we have been riding to the top of the food chain on planet Earth as a human species. And it's poignant. It's poignant, isn't it? To realize that much of what we must do is swim against the current, right? Including the currents of the ways in which we evolved to suffer and crave more to survive. The machinery of craving is biological. It's primarily biological. It's deeply embedded in us, and it takes a lot of cultivation and a lot of love and a lot of insight. Those are the big three that really make a change over time. The cultivation of equanimity that's embodied, the opening and the warming of the heart, and the deepening of vipassana, of true insight, liberating insight. Those are the big three that we engage in our practice, just to kind of headline those three themes. Okay, I see a hand there from Ben. I'm asking you to unmute. You can unmute yourself, I believe. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Rick. I have to. I wanted to ask you if you could expound a little bit on the concept of. I think you mentioned that we have a certain negativity bias built in. I just finished Joseph Ledoux's book, The Emotional Brain.
Yeah.
And I came away a little, and I know it's a little dated, but I came away thinking that the battle between my amygdala and hippocampus and my neocortex was a losing battle.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's sort of what you were referring to, and if there's anything more recent to guide us in dealing with that negativity bias.
Yeah. Well, one of the more robust findings in neuropsychology, grounded in an evolutionary view, is the finding of the brain's negativity bias. It's offset in some minor ways, relatively minor ways, in which people can have an optimism bias around certain kinds of calculations or risk-reward, cost-benefit analyses. But basically, we definitely have a negativity bias for emotionally saturated experiences. The brain is designed to do 5 things. Continually scan for bad news out in the world or inside your own mind or your body. Second, to over-focus upon the bad news when you find it. Instantly, there's a tunnel vision around physical pain or interpersonal issues. Over-focusing, now we're losing the sense of the field. It's when we're in a more positive state of mind, we tend to be more perceptually open. When there's some kind of negative stimulus, we lock down upon it to deal with it. Third, we overreact to it. We routinely react more to loss than to gain of equivalent amounts. Somebody gives you $100, thanks. You open your wallet and you realize someone has stolen $100 from you. What? Right? So we react more to loss than to gain, more to pain than to pleasure. We overreact to it. Fourth, really important, we overlearn from it. So much research here that we remember negative information more than positive information. Negative interactions in a relationship have typically more impact than positive interactions. Therefore, we need a quantity effect for positive interactions. That was a cautionary realization when I was in grad school and came upon it and rewound the last several days with my wife. Whoa, I needed to raise my game and increase the ratio of positive to negative from her perspective. Anyway, that's fourth, we overlearn. And then fifth, really interesting, the brain becomes sensitized to stress, anxiety, irritation, anger, fear, and loss through the hormone cortisol, which you're talking about our buddies here, the amygdala and the hippocampus. Cortisol sensitizes the amygdala, the alarm bell of the brain, and weakens the nearby hippocampus, which calms down the amygdala and puts things in perspective, creating a vicious cycle in which stressful experiences today sensitize us to them tomorrow. Now, to be clear, mindfulness is the circuit breaker. Mindfulness disrupts that internalization process because it gives us a spaciousness, a distance from stressful, painful, irritating, and hurtful experiences. Really, really important. So there's nothing in what I'm saying that's about resisting painful, stressful experiences. We need to be wise in our relationship to them. But it's definitely true that there is this negativity bias, Ben, and there's no comparable positivity bias for it. So for me, the takeaway is summarized, and I tend to be a list kind of person because that's how I remember stuff in my aging mind. Deal with the bad, turn to the good, take in the good. Deal with the bad. When we're upset about something or there's a worldly condition, the world's flashing red, we got to deal with it. No, nothing here about, putting our head in the sand or, pie in the sky, no rose-colored glasses. We want to see what's problematic, for sure. But don't dwell there. There's a traditional saying that your mind takes its shape from what it rests upon. The neuroplastic update would be that your brain takes its shape from where your mind rests. So it's a really fundamental question. Where does your attention dwell? Where our attention dwells gradually becomes what dwells within us. And that's cautionary for many, many people who spend a lot of time ruminating and dwelling on resentments, self-criticism, beating themselves up, beating other people up in their mind, their righteous case against others, really caught in that. That gets, boom, internalized into neural structure. Not good. So it's really important to feel what we feel in a mindful way and fairly rapidly cope with it, deal with it, and then turn to the good. Because we need to help the good to sink in. What is also true, not as a spiritual bypass, what is also true, in part to resource us to deal with what's bad, what's problematic and painful. And then as we have wholesome states, beneficial states in which we realize things or we become more skillful or we have a sense of our own bodhicitta, our own goodness, we start to experience some of what Henry teaches. I'm kind of summarizing as the wild arising, rooted, grounded in a non-local kind of love. As we have those states of being, we can slow it down and take in the good and really let them land inside us. And that fundamental process, deal with the bad, turn to the good, take in the good in an ongoing upward spiral, is a beautiful path of practice.
Great.
So on that note, I'll thank you for your kind attention
Well,
and turn it over to Henry. Oh, thank you, Ben.
Thank you.